So, we are in Exodus. We got all the way through chapter 1 last week. Wow. I know some of you are like, this is going to be a long time. Hopefully, we'll speed it up, and there'll be some sections as we go that we'll kind of group together and kind of go through fairly quickly. But you gotta get a good intro. You gotta understand what's going on. So, we are in Exodus chapter 2 tonight. What we left off was Moses was born, right? So Moses was born, and just a couple things to keep in kind of the back of your mind as you read this. Remember, Exodus was not meant to be read alone. It was made to be read in order with Genesis, right? So there's going to be lots of things that go back, and we looked at some of those last week, and we're going to look at some this week. And so if you're just reading, if you're an Israelite and you're looking at your history and the only thing that you have is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and you're reading through, you would start at the front, you would go to the back, right? It kind of makes sense. So as you're reading through this, it's always pointing backwards, but then a lot of it is also, we'll see tonight, is a lot of pointing forward, right? Not just pointing forward to Jesus, which we'll look at tonight, but also just pointing forward to a near history. And we'll kind of point out as we go. And so just kind of put your mind in that Hebrew reader, that Israelite reader, of just reading it and kind of understanding in the whole story, right? So you know Genesis, and now we're in Exodus, and it just kind of makes a little bit more sense. All right, so verse 1 of chapter 2, now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. And it's interesting, when you think about it, Moses is writing this. He's writing this about his mom and his dad and them getting together. And there's a lot that, we would want to know, right? If we were writing this, we want to know the details, right? How did they meet? Where did they date? Where did they take their first kiss, right? That's just kind of what we want to know. But as Moses is writing this, he just says it's a man and a woman. We don't even learn their names until many chapters after this, right? So, but what's important is that he's from the house of Levi, and she's from the house or the tribe of Levi, which we don't know at this point in Exodus, but we will find out. At the end of Exodus and even in Leviticus, what happens when there's tribes? What is the tribe of Levi known for, right? It's that priestly tribe, right? So we understand, we're starting to get a kind of a precursor reading this. Okay, who's Moses going to be? He's a Hebrew but raised Egyptian, and now his parents are what? They're from the priestly tribe, right? So it's almost like a little prophetic message of what Moses is going to be. We're going to see a little bit more of that in another chapter, right? So the house of Levi took his wife as a Levite woman, and the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. What's interesting about the story of Moses, especially at the beginning, and especially at Exodus, as you're going to see, we see here in verse 2, the woman conceived. We know that there was a man, we know he was a Levite, that's all we get. And we're going to start to see that a woman conceived, a sister helped in kind of finding the mom and taking in and helping with the Pharaoh's daughter. We're going to see a Pharaoh's woman. You're going to start seeing some kind of a change, right? The book of Genesis is mainly about men, right? It's setting up a history, it's setting up a patriarch, but very quickly in the book of Exodus tonight, in Exodus 2, and we're going to see this continue to go forth, we're going to see that women are important. God uses women, which is not normally the case, right? It was definitely not even thought of to be the case in the ancient Near East, but we're going to start to see these kind of female pronouns and people that just stick out, that for us is just a normal read, but for somebody in the ancient Near East in this culture would have been striking that even a woman would be mentioned. Who cares, right? But it is important to the story, and it's important in God's story that God uses all people to His will, right? So it's just important to just kind of point that out. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she found him, it was a fine child. Now, fine child can be a lot. It can mean a lot of things. And there's a lot of speculation, a lot of books written on just these two words, fine child. What does it mean? It doesn't mean that he was handsome, that he was physical beauty. We see two places in the New Testament. We have Acts chapter 7, verse 20. Stephen tells us that Moses was exceedingly handsome. Okay, he's handsome. And then we find in Hebrews chapter 11, those of you who read Hebrews with us, verse 23, that he was a handsome baby. So we have in Scripture that he was good looking. But, does a mom, birth a child and is instantly stricken by how beautiful that child is? I've seen both of my kids born, and I can just tell you, I was not stricken by their beauty. It's gross, right? It's just nasty. What? That doesn't make sense. But here we can see that he was a fine child. There are lots of rabbi traditions. There's a lot of apocryphal books. There's a lot of Jewish folklore around what this means. The best of them means if you were to ask a Jew today, what does this mean? They would say that most Jews believe that when it says that he was a fine child, most rabbis teach and have passed down that he was born circumcised. All right, so he was born circumcised, and that would be interesting. That would just be neat, right? That would be like, okay, that's different. But that's not in Scripture. That is just kind of what the Jewish belief means. It just means there's something in this. Probably the best thought of this is kind of, once again, going back. If we keep with what Scripture has already showed us in one chapter, if we go back to Genesis, we find a word, and the word is tob, T-O-B. The word is tob, and we see that time and time again in the first two chapters of Genesis, and it says what? God created light, and it was tob. It was good. And he created this, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. And so when it says that he saw that it was a fine child, we can use this and think about that word of just saying that it was good. It was something that God created. It was ordained. It was a feeling. It was a spiritual thought that when, for whatever reason, that when Moses' mother saw him, that she realized that he was a fine child. What you believe of this, it really doesn't matter, right? I mean, if you believe he was circumcised, go for it, right? But we don't have that in Scripture. We do know he was handsome. We do know he's beautiful. Will that stop a mom? Probably not, because every mom thinks their kids are beautiful, right? This is what happens. And most dads do not think that, right, of their own sons, right? This don't happen. So what happened? He was a fine child. She hid him for 3 months, right? Remember, the edict that played on at the last verse that we read in chapter 1, that all babies would be thrown on into the Nile, right? When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and a pitch. And so when she could hide him no longer, why couldn't she hide a baby any longer in 3 months? He's going to cry, right? He's got good lungs. He's going to be loud. Some of you, whether it was your own kids or whether you worked in the church nursery, right? There's kids that are good and quiet kids, and there's kids who are good and loud kids, right? It just happens. Some babies cry more than others, and so here you could say, and you got to understand when you read about Moses, when you think about Moses, Moses is probably the most written about and fantasized figure of the Jewish nation, even over Abraham. And so when you read about Moses and you think about Moses, and then you start reading things from the Jewish history and some teachings on him, a lot of things become a little bit more fantasized than probably what's true. But in this, like I said, some believe that he was circumcised. A lot of Jews will believe that when it says that he only had 3 months And that's because he was loud. He was a loud crier. He was already blessed with a loud voice. Because God had already created him for the deliverance, and how would a man speak to millions of people? He would have to have a loud voice. And so, once again, not scriptural, but just giving you a way to think of this. But he was a fine child. She had him for 3 months, and then what happened? She took him and put him in a basket. Now, what's interesting is this word basket is the word teba. The word teba, and it's very interesting if you read this in the Hebrew, when you're reading and you've read Genesis, and now you get to Exodus, and you say he hits him in a teba. It is the word that we translate to an ark, A-R-K, right? So the only places in all of the Bible that we see the word teba is in Genesis 6 and 7, in Noah's account, and right here in the Moses' account. So you're reading this, and he says he put him into an ark, and what happened? It was an ark made out of bulrushes and covered in bitumen and pitch. What was the ark covered in? Bitumen and pitch, right? So he put him in an ark, the same as Noah. So as the reader, and you're reading this for the first time and you never heard the story, you're instantly drawn back to Noah. Noah was put in a boat. What happened? He was saved. He was going to be the leader. He was what's going to happen. So you're already kind of getting a little prophetical look of what's going to happen to Moses, right? You kind of start to see the brains churning. God is already kind of redoing a story here that we would know. And so she made him a basket, and I wrote down here some little notes that both Noah and Moses are specifically selected to forego a tragic watery fate. Both are placed on an ark, treated in bitumen and pitch. Both are carried on safety on the very body of water that brings destruction to others. Both are vehicles whom God creates a new people for his own purpose. Right? He takes Noah and his wife and creates the rest of the world, and he takes Israel and he creates the rest of the world, right? And even you kind of have the idea that Moses' story looks back to the flood, but also looks forward to the passage through the sea in Exodus chapter 14 that we'll get to hopefully one day. That we kind of have this, right? But you have this idea that he was in an ark with bitumen and pitch, and she put him and the child in it and placed him among the reeds by the riverbanks, right? A lot of times in Sunday school, when you had your flannel boards, what happened? We got him floating down the Nile. He wasn't floating down the Nile. He was placed in a place in the reeds in which he wouldn't have floated anywhere, right? One of those reasons is what? He would be found, hopefully, is probably what they did. A second version is because in the reeds, because of these long kind of hollow tubes that would come up, it would be a place where the crocodiles would not go because it would puncture their soft underbelly. And so it was kind of a safety. Remember, we're in the Nile River. Some of the world's deadliest crocodiles is where they live even today, right? So there's a little placement, hopefully to be found, hopefully to keep and to be safety, not just to float down and just, I hope it works out. There's a little interesting kind of there, but what's interesting is that the child that was once abandoned in the reeds will eventually rescue the people and walk them through the reed sea, right? We say red, but in the Hebrew it's the reed sea, right? So you kind of have that idea. So this is kind of interesting. You're kind of reading and you're just, okay, these words are picking up, and just like when you say ark, you think of Noah 6, you think of Genesis 6, but when you're thinking about the reeds, and then later on, when they come to the reed sea, then Moses walks through the reed sea, what it takes you back to Exodus chapter 2, right? So these words are just kind of conveying you all along the story of the Pentateuch, of the Torah. And his sister stood at a distance, right? Sister, notice that, another woman pronoun, right? His sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh, another woman, came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. Now, I think we talked about this last week, but the Pharaoh's daughter wasn't bathing in the Nile because it was the clean and purest water, because it's not. It's gross. It's full of dirt and sediment. It's one of the kind of best places to farm, but because it was life-giving. It was the god of the Niles, right? And so you kind of have this idea. So she's bathing there to spiritually worship and to get favor with the gods that she worships. So she's there doing something ungodly, and what does she do? She finds little baby Moses in an ark in the reeds, right? So she goes and has her servant to get him, to get Moses. Now notice her servant went. She didn't go, right? Our flannel graph, sometimes we kind of mess that up in Sunday school. But she goes, right? Because she's not going into the reeds where these long pokey sticks are sticking out of everywhere, right? So she's just into the deep part, and they probably had it channeled out, a nice pool that was for Pharaoh and for the Pharaoh's family. That would have been clean and nice and crocodile free. But she sends her servant into the crocodile infested water, into the spiky little reed area to get this baby. When she opened it, she saw a child, and behold, the baby was crying, right? So he was loud once again. Yes, she took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children, right? So what's interesting is she took pity on him, that God, in his story and his weaving through of what he's doing, what does he do? He takes something that is pure and normal, like a woman seeing a baby, right? You never have a newborn baby and you see a group of women and they're like, ooh, you don't look good. What happens, right? You get a group of women and they see a baby, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the kid looks like. It could be an ugly kid, but they're like, right? Because that's the mama instinct, right? That's the woman instinct. And so God is not only just using Moses' mom, Moses' sister, the Pharaoh's daughter, but he's using the woman instinct, right, to kind of help and to fall in love, to have compassion, and be able to want and to be able to keep Pharaoh. But she saw that he was a Hebrew children, no doubt by complexion, by hair color, probably what he was wrapped in, right? He was not blonde-haired and white-skinned and blue-eyed like Jesus, right? So he would have been different. This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter. So now, once again, we have this young lady, coming out, right? And this young girl coming out and speaking to the Pharaoh's daughter. Would never have happened. Much like we talked last week that the Pharaoh called for the two Hebrew maidservants, would have never. That's a God thing. It would never ever would the king of the world talk to two Hebrew maidservants, and never ever in the world would it be appropriate for a Hebrew child to come up to Pharaoh's daughter. Right. So these just don't work, but it did work and it did happen. So God is moving in these situations. This would kind of been like that. You're just like, if you're watching a movie today, you're like, right? That's one of these moments, right? And his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? And the Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the girl went and called the child's mother. That would be her mother. That's Moses' mother. So just notice what God is doing here, right? So God's doing this, and in all of this, he's happening. What happens? He allows the daughter allows Pharaoh's daughter to find baby Moses, and Moses' sister sees this, speaks to Pharaoh's daughter, which is amazing, and then says, hey, I happen to know somebody who has just had a child, and they could continue to keep breastfeeding your child and raise them up, right? And they're like, would you like me to go get them? And she's like, absolutely, that sounds great. And so now what happens? She goes and gets Moses' mother, brings her back, and so now Moses' mom is reconvened back with Moses. And then the best part, and the Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away, nurse him for me, and I will give you wages. What she had to do under distress to give away, God took, multiplied, blessed, reunited them, and now she's even getting paid to be a mother for her own kid, right? That's crazy. That's a Hallmark story right there, ladies, right? It's unbelievable, right? But it happened, right? It happens, and it's amazing that God is doing it. It says, I'll even pay you for this. So the woman, which is Moses' mother, took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. Now, what's interesting about the word Moses, because he draws him out of the water, that's a Hebrew name, right? Moses, to draw out of the water, it's the word Moshe. Moshe in Hebrew, Moshe. But an Egyptian princess would never have given Moses a Hebrew name. It would not have happened, right? So what happens, right? And a lot of things, especially in Deuteronomy, there's a lot more details that we wish we would know. Remember, Moses wrote all 5 books in his lifetime, and so a lot of things are happening, right? And so you don't get all the details that we want. But Moses is also, Moshe, the Hebrew word, but it's also an Egyptian verb. And it's an Egyptian verb meaning to bear, to give birth to, right? To come out of. And so Moses is probably the shortened name to a longer Egyptian name, right? So in Egyptian world, in Egyptian dynasties, in Egyptian thought, nobody had just one name, right? It just doesn't happen. So you kind of have, we talked about right now in the story, you have Thutmose the second is the Pharaoh, right? And so you have Thutmose the second, who's the Pharaoh. Thutmose's name was not Thutmose. His true Egyptian name was born of the god Thoth, which got shortened to Throthmos, right? And so Moses probably has some longer Egyptian name that got translated down to Moses with the Egyptian verb of Moshe, right? So you kind of have that idea. So we don't know that. It's not important to the story. But just know that Pharaoh's stepchild wouldn't be named an Egyptian or a Hebrew name, right? It just wouldn't happen. That would look bad. And so just kind of Jeopardy moment right there for you, right? So she named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. One day, when Moses had grown up, 40 years old, okay? 40 years old, we know this, right? 40 years old, Acts chapter 7, verse 23. When he was 40 years old, he came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. So when Moses was 40, when he had his first over-the-hill experience, right? Moses dies at 120. So he gets to see the hill 3 times, right? And so when he's 40, something happens, right? Something happens that he says, I need to leave. I need to leave the pyramids, right? I need to leave Egypt. I need to go out and see my kin. And so all this is going on. So when Moses had grown up at 40 years old, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. So here in verse 11, we realize, right, that he's 40. We see that from Acts. But we notice, even if we didn't have Acts, if we're just reading the Pentateuch, that what happens, that at this age, at a certain point, he has come to the conclusion, somebody has told him, probably his mother, not his stepmother, but probably his mother, raising him up, of his heritage, of knowing where he comes from. And so he says, we can see in verse 11, that he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. So at 40, at this I wouldn't say midlife crisis, but he had 3 hills. So what is that, like a trial life experience? I don't know. And so you kind of have this, at 40, he started to identify with the Hebrews. And so that's why he wanted to go out. That's why it says he started to see his oppression. Probably before this time, before God started moving in his heart, he didn't see the oppression as probably so much of the Hebrews, right? They were just a slave task force. They did what he did, and he was just doing what he was doing, and they were going on. But what happens? We meet God, our heart starts to change, right? Things happen, and we have this, and we start to view things a little differently. Moses views them differently, and he goes out, and now he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he identifies not with the Egyptian that was in charge, which he was, but he identifies with the Hebrew, the slave that was getting beat. And when you read this in the Greek, he killed him. Okay, it was death. It wasn't just he just beat him down. It was death. So Charles hasn't had that one right? So he struck him down. Let's see. Verse 12. He looked this way, and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand, right? So he was mad. He was with vengeance. He wanted to cast judgment on the Egyptian. He was identifying with Hebrew people, and so he breaks down and he killed the Egyptian. When he went out the next day, so it wasn't just a one-day experience. Probably for a while, Moses has been going out, seeing the Hebrews and talking to them and getting around, probably, no doubt, seeing his mother and his sister, right? Kind of rekindling that relationship. But when he went out, The next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling against each other. In the Hebrew language, it's almost the same sentences back to back, where it uses the words. It says that the Hebrew and the Egyptians were fighting and one beat him down. It's almost the exact same words in the Hebrew when it says that the Hebrew was fighting against the Hebrew, right? So a Hebrew is trying to kill a Hebrew, right? So you can imagine when you're family and you're trying to kill somebody else in your family, that doesn't go well, right? There's an issue there. It's bad enough that God's people were being oppressed by Egypt, but God's people were defeating God's people, right? It makes it even worse, right? It makes it really bad when somebody that's lost talks about somebody in our church, but it hurts even more when somebody inside the church talks about somebody inside the church, right? We're family, right? We don't do that. We have that. And so here, Pharaoh goes out and sees this. Not Pharaoh. Moses goes out and sees this. Two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" And he answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you had killed the Egyptian?" Right? So, once again, that word strike down is the same word that we see above. So probably the Hebrew killed the Hebrew. That's what the language lends us to. And so, of course, Moses goes out and says, "What in the world? Why are you doing this?" And notice where it says, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" Moses was truly their prince, right? He was the Egyptian prince. And so, but here we see that the Hebrews did not identify that Moses was the prince. They knew he was the prince. They knew who he was, but they did not hold him to. So probably what this lends the idea, and once again, there's a lot of lending. There's not a lot of details when you get into Moses' life. But probably as Moses was making these trips out to the Hebrews, and they're seeing them, and he's starting to learn them, and it's probably the Hebrews were starting to see him as a Hebrew, right? Not just as an Egyptian. And so you can imagine his mom and his dad and his sisters and his family are telling the story of Moses and how he put him in a thing and he was adopted and he was taken in and now he's so everybody in Hebrew world knew who Moses was, but probably really knew the real story of who he was, right? And so here, when he goes and says, "Hey, why did you kill that guy?" They said, who made you a prince, right? Who made you king? Who made you judge? Your daddy made you God, right? All the things that we say today, right? Well, who made you this, right? And then he says, do you mean to kill me like you killed the Egyptians? So they know of what he did. They know that he killed this past Egyptian. Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely this thing is known. Now, what's interesting is the next verse. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. Why do you think he sought to kill Moses? He was the son of Egypt. Do you think Pharaoh's son could kill anybody he wanted and get away with it? Absolutely. Absolutely. Pharaoh's son could kill anybody. There was no penalty under killing an Egyptian. You have to believe that Pharaoh killed Egyptians every single day. So why would he be scared? Why would he run away? Probably the best kind of outtake of this is saying that the Pharaoh himself knew, of course he knew that he was a Hebrew. He was an adopted son of his daughter, right? Of course he knew this. But at this point, Pharaoh probably knew that Moses was walking among the slaves. He was getting to know his Hebrew background, right? He was starting to go out. And so you can imagine at this point that Pharaoh and Moses were probably not on the best terms, right? You have Moses who's been trained, who is really, Moses has given, it was kind of given Pharaoh 30 years of his life and trained under the best and done everything. But now here you have 40-year-old Pharaoh being a teenager, basically, and saying, "You're not my parents, right? You're not my family. I want to know my real mom. I want to know my real dad," right? You kind of have this idea, right? And so probably, once again, there's a lot of probablys here, but when you think about this, when Pharaoh heard of this, he sought to kill Moses. And it was kind of working on this thing that he's not a true Egyptian, and he's becoming more kin and more loved and more called towards the Hebrew. And so Pharaoh was like, "You're not my real son anyway, so we'll just kind of end this, right? Remember, what does every Pharaoh hate? Even though this is the same Pharaoh that didn't want the slaves to become overpopulated because of why? Because they were afraid they would take over, right? So now if Moses, the son of Pharaoh, is befriending this populous nation of slaves, could he potentially be their leader and come against Egypt? Absolutely he could, and become Pharaoh. So Pharaoh is not going to let Moses do that, right? So when Moses heard this, he was afraid, and Pharaoh heard of it. He sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now Midian, it's not a truly huge place. It's not an important place. There's a couple of notes I wrote in here about it. It does have some things, right? Some significant points to it. In Midian, he gets his wife. He gets his children, right? He gets advice from his father-in-law, Jethro. He's going to come back to Midian in Exodus 18. He's going to come back and say, hey, father-in-law, I can't really go to my dad. It's just going to happen. I need some help. I need some advice. And so he comes back to Midian for some advice. We're going to find out later on that in the book of Numbers, the Midianites, the people who kind of take over that region, they become a huge stumbling block for Israel, right? They started to intermarry into Israel, Numbers 25. So you'll hear Midian again come back, and then also at the we end the Midian kind of walk is in Judges. All the Midianites get killed by a judge. You know who? Gideon. Very good. That's Bible Jeopardy 101 right there. They all get slaughtered by Gideon. And so you'll hear Midian. Also, Midian serves to top Moses to the patriarchs. Midian was one of Abraham's sons, which is kind of namesake, right? He was a son by Keturah, Genesis chapter 25. And also, remember, if you're ready with Genesis, I've heard Midian before. Okay, that was one of Abraham's sons. Where else have I heard Midian? Oh, yeah, the slaves that brought Joseph to Egypt were Midianites, right? So you kind of keep seeing it. It just keeps coming in play, and it'll keep coming in play all the way until Gideon destroys it. And so just a couple of things that's interesting about Midian, Jeopardy moments, right? And so he came to Midian, and he sat down by a well. That's important, right? So it's not just a dirt place. That's a well. Somebody has lived there. Somebody has dug a well there. It's an important place. It's been there. So he sat down by the well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs with the water in their father's flocks. And the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flocks. Now it's interesting. I don't know who talked about the Charlton Heston. It was one of y'all over here. But if you remember watching this, it's to me it's the funny scene because it's the bad fighting scene. You're like, oh yeah, and they all just run away. But you can imagine, right? He's sitting there. He has walked from Egypt. He's left everything. You leave Egypt and you go to where Midian is at. Just to let you know, that's desert to desert. There's no stopping, right? There's this, so you can imagine he's tired, he's exhausted. There's a well, he's drinking water. He's probably just homeless and camped out there for a while. And now these 7 young ladies are come, and they bring their sheep and their goats, and Moses is like, ladies, and they're like, sir, you're like, okay, this is interesting. And now these bad guys, they kind of roll in, and what happens? And Moses stood up and he saved them. But what's interesting is not that he stood up for them and saved them, but what happened next? He watered their flocks. He instantly, with a snap of a finger, became a shepherd, right? We're starting to see, and we're going to see in chapter 3, that he's going to become a shepherd. But not only did he just save the ladies, which, if you're the prince of Egypt, ladies, I'm just going to say Moses probably wasn't a virgin, right? He probably wasn't, he didn't have his virginity ring on, right? Right? And it's just kind of the idea, right? So you kind of have this idea, and what happens? Not only does he save the ladies, but then he takes care of the sheep. He waters the flocks. This is something that he is not kin to doing. It's kind of unusual. But when they came home to their father Raul, he said, how is it that you have come home so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock. What do they call him? An Egyptian, right? Still dressed like an Egyptian. He would have been manicured and nice like an Egyptian. He would not have been like a Hebrew, a slave. Even though he was identifying with them, he still had all the pleasantries of the palace, right? So an Egyptian delivered us, and he watered our flocks. And he said to his daughters, then where is he? Why have you left this man? Call him that he may eat bread. And then Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. What's interesting about the story is what happens. A few verses before this, he feels a calling, right? He feels a calling to get to know his people, his kinsmen, the Hebrews. He goes along. 2 Hebrews are fighting, basically fighting to death, and he steps in and says, why are you guys fighting? Can't we all just get along, right? It's one of those statements. And what happens? And they're like, get out of here. You're a loser. You're nobody. Even they start bringing up his past. But now what happens? He goes to a Gentile. Sound familiar? He goes to a Gentile, not his Jewish clan. They despised him. He goes to a Gentiles, and what happens? They accept him. They embrace him. So does that sound familiar, right? Sound familiar? Just a little ghost, just a little something of what's to happen, what is to come. It's just an interesting point, right? And so, just to say, if you're reading through the Pentateuch, right, and you're Hebrew, you would never pick up on that, right? You just kind of like, okay, that's kind of weird, but okay, these people find out. But on this side of Jesus Christ, and then you go back and you read the Bible, and you're just like, well, Jesus didn't really come to the Gospels. Are you kidding me? Right? We're in Exodus chapter 2. We've seen Jesus like 4 times already, right? You'll just see this, right? You'll just see. And it's not the full glimpse. It's not a full-fledged prophecy that Jesus is going to come out. Those will come. But even in the very beginning, right? Even in the very beginning, you can see he went to his people. He was despised, and he went to, and what happened? He saves the Gentiles, right? He feeds them. He takes care of them. He becomes their shepherd. He is welcomed to their house, and he is welcomed. And what happens? And there's a marriage of church, right? Marriage. And then what happens? And then eventually the salvation of Israel. I mean, I literally, you can preach that because that's the Bible, right? That's the New Testament. But anyway, so there you go. Just a little something for you to think about. Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he got his wife Zipporah. He got a wife. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom. And he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. This word Gershom, it's made out of 2 Hebrew words. The word ger, it means to drive out, and the word Sam, this is how we would pronounce it. It's not how they pronounce it. But Sam, it means an alien there. So his son's name is a constant reminder of his banishment, that he is an alien. He's an alien out there in no man's land, right? So it's just kind of interesting, right? When you're naming your kids, you're thinking, oh, something great, something godly, something good. He names his kid after really his sin, right? His walking away, his banishment from all that was good. So a couple things to put on. I just kind of mentioned some, but Moses embodies Israel because he enters into conflict with Egypt and becomes a subject of a murderous edict of Pharaoh. He has to flee from Egypt to the wilderness, and he testifies to having become a sojourner in a foreign land, right? So even not only do you can kind of see Moses and you see a little prophetic kind of blurred image of Jesus, you can look at Moses and you see a prophetic blurred image of Israel that's about to come. They're going to go. They're going to be a foreigner. They're going to sojourn. All right, kind of have that idea. Verse 23. During those days, during those many days, the king of Egypt died. Those many days. That's another 40 years. Okay, so Moses is now 80 years old. Right, he's almost as old as some of y'all. Right, that's a joke. I can laugh. Right. And so during those many days, so he has been a shepherd, he has been married, and he has been populating for 40 years in Midian, right? So those many days, the king of Egypt died, Thutmose II, now we're on Thutmose III. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and their cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew, right? So notice this, that we have a change of pharaohs, right? And so the change of pharaohs that happens, so you now have the son. So you have Thutmose II, who is on the throne, that has tried to kill all of the Hebrews and did not do successfully well. So do you think his son, Thutmose III, the next heir, do you think he loved the Hebrews, or do you think he hated them? Well, of course, he's going to hate them more than his father, right? And this is what happens. So he becomes more oppressive. And so even more oppressive than he was, what happens? They start to crawl, they start to groan. And what's interesting about this is it says that their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. Not that it hasn't been there. God knows that all things are going on. But notice in verse 24 it says, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham. Pushing us all the way back to Genesis, right? You've already read Genesis. Now we're on Exodus. What was that covenant with Abraham? What was going on, right? That all this has happened. God has promised them that he's going to rescue them. He's going to pull them out of Egypt. And we'll look at that a little bit more in chapter 3. And so God saw and God knew that the people of Israel, God is in complete control. Even in the long wait period of Egypt, over these almost 400 years of slavery, he's known this. What's interesting, though, about those words, when in verses 24 and 25, it says God heard, and it says God remembered, God saw, and God knew. Right? We see three verbs. We see three verbs that are attached to God as the noun. What's interesting about these words, the word heard, sama, means to hear and to respond. It doesn't mean just to hear. It means that you hear something and then you do it. The word remember, zahar, means to actively act on something that you remembered, right? You're just kind of like, oh, I remember I have to take out the trash tonight. And you get up and you go do it, right? You remember something and then you do it. God saw is the word ra. It means to begin, move towards something. You see something and you start to move towards that. And then God knew the word yada, 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 right? You never knew you knew Hebrew. You're talking about your wife, right? Yada, 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 yada. But God knew yada means to share an experience with one another that one can understand, right? So it means that you can sympathize with somebody and you understand it, and so you can move on. So it's interesting about those last two verses. When it's talking about God knowing about it, it wasn't that God knew, but now he's saying that God knew he's doing something about it, right? Everyone is an action verb. God heard, and so he's going to respond. God remembered, so he's going to do something about it. God saw, so he's getting up to do something. God knew. So when it says that God knew, you'll have people who don't know Scripture be like, well, see, God doesn't know everything because God didn't know that they were being in slavery. No, he knew. Right? He knew so much that even all the way back in Genesis, he gives us some prophetic words that says they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. So he already knew before it happened, before Joseph even got to Egypt, that was going to happen. But now, not only did he know, but now he's going to do something about it. Right? So God knows when we're in slavery, when we're in oppression, when we're being beat down. Right? But it doesn't mean that God doesn't care. It just means it's not his time. He knows, but he might not be walking toward us. He might not be hearing us and doing something about it. He might not be remembering something, right? So remember that on Sunday mornings when we're talking about 1 Peter. They're writing to all these churches in oppression. Why doesn't God do something? Because he's God, right? He doesn't have to do anything. He knows it, but it's not his time, right? Everything's in his timing. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law. Right? So now we have these 40 years where he just saved his wife and his sister-in-laws, and then after he saved them, he gave them water, and now 40 years later, now he's 80 years old in the desert, and now he's a full-fledged farmer, right? He's a shepherd, is keeping the flock of his father-in-law. Now, if you were reading this, and you were reading this as a Hebrew, and you read through Genesis, you would think of something really important and kind of funny. And maybe you know. If you remember the story of Joseph was in Egypt. He is already the number 2 guy. And what happens? You have Jacob and all of his brothers. They come and they see Pharaoh and they realize, and Joseph comes out and says, it's me. So they go back. And then they come a second time and he decides to feed them. right? They just had to feed them with the Pharaoh. And if you remember in the book of Genesis, what happens? They set up another table that Jacob and all of his brothers would sit at. Because why? Because Scripture tells us that Egyptians, that shepherds are an abomination to Egyptians. They're an abomination. They loathe them. They hate them, right? So that's Genesis 43. If you want to catch up on that story, what's funny is you just kind of come off that at the end of Genesis, and now you're going to have the leader of Egypt, right? You have Prince Moses. You know, even though he's a stepchild, what happens? He becomes a shepherd, an abomination, right? So not only did he walk away from Egypt, not only did he identify with the Hebrews, not only did he leave Egypt, but now he's become everything that literally Egypt hates, right? A shepherd. It's just kind of one of those stories, right? That God picks the weirdest people to do the most godliest things, right? Honestly, think of it. Would you pick the people in this room? Would you pick the people in this room if you were God to grow this church in this community? Would you pick us? I wouldn't pick us. I'd pick like Billy Graham, I'd pick some, NFL quarterback. I'd pick somebody that was nice, that could, really draw the people. They stood out for Jesus, they could really go. But God uses just the weirdest people to do his will, right? And so he takes the prince of Egypt and then takes to be something that they loathe, that they hate. And God is going to use that to do something amazing and mighty. Anyways, he was keeping the flock of the father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Anybody ever wonder why he went to the wilderness? Anybody ever wonder that? You see, when I read the Bible, I ask way more questions than what it gives me. Were they out of grass? Were they not going? Was God kind of wooing him out to the wilderness? We don't know. And Scripture never answers it. It's just kind of something you ask, west side of the wilderness. And what happens? They come to Horeb. Horeb is really kind of two main thoughts. They're both right. It just really depends on who you talk to. You can say half the world is going to say Horeb and Sinai are the exact same. Okay? They're going to say Horeb is going to, in Exodus, it's going to be called Horeb until you get to the middle of Exodus, and it's going to be called Sinai. And then after Exodus, it'll be called Horeb and Sinai back and forth until Revelation. And so they're the same thing. Same mountain, same peak, same whatever. The other half of the world is going to say that Horeb is referring to a general region. We would call them today like a mountain range, an area. So you would, if you go to the Smoky Mountains, you say, oh, look, there's the Smoky Mountains. You don't say this is Mount whatever, right? Because there's little peaks all in that, right? And so Horeb is kind of an area, and where Mount Sinai is a specific mountain or peak in that area. It really doesn't matter, just letting you know what it is. But Horeb, Mount Sinai. So they go from Midian to Sinai, which it's not a close walk, it's in the distance. They came to Horeb, the mountain of God. What's interesting is we don't know that it's the mountain of God, right? You're reading that first time, brand new, right? You're reading this, you're like, what? Mountain of God? Like, wow, okay, interesting. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. Angel of the Lord, we can talk a lot about that. There's lots of angels of the Lord, but basically there's really two types. There's one that is going to be kind of, we would say, a Christophanist, is going to be a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. And then there's another one that is lots of different people, messengers of the Lord, right? Angels. And so in this one, it is not, well, it's debated, but Pastor Sean was going to say this is not Jesus. Okay, it's not Christoph. It's not pre-incarnate Jesus. It's a messenger of the Lord. And a lot of those you can tell in how they refer and how they talk. But it's kind of debated. But anyways, an angel of the Lord appeared. How did he appear? A flame of fire. This is going to become very popular in the book of Exodus. We're going to talk about fire more than you've ever talked about fire as we continue on. Not only on the Mount of Sinai, but in the tabernacle and in heaven, and we're going to keep that theme going. So fire, just an initial theme, but it's going to be out there. I came to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. What's interesting about this fire is what? Is that the bush is not consumed, right? It's different than any other fire that Moses would have known. And what's interesting about this is that when you think of and you're reading about a fire that is different, that is a non-consuming fire, it's not just a different fire, but it's almost like it's a new fire. It's when you read this in Hebrew, we talked a little bit of this about last week. It's using the words that's called creation language. It's kind of like when he says, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and there be fish. It's this language like it's creation. It's a new thing. And so when you're reading this, when the reader is saying, okay, there's a fire that is non-consuming the bush, the reader is understanding very quickly, probably quicker than Moses did in real life, that this is God. This is the creator God creating this instant. This is something that's powerful, that's different. And so it's just kind of interesting to know that. In the Hebrew, it reads very, very kind of plain and you kind of instantly know this is God, where Moses is kind of like, what's wrong with that bush? That's different. Hey, let me go see that bush, right? But the reader sees different. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet is not being consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, while the bush is not burned. And what's interesting is, we don't know, right? We get our thoughts from Charlton Heston. We don't know where this bush was at, okay? We don't know. You can, if you got an AK-47 and some rocket launchers, you can go to Mount Sinai today, and you need a small army with you too, but you can go there. But then, there's places that they say this is where it was. Okay, nobody really knows, right? And Charlton Heston, he climbs up the mountainside, right? For one, he's not tending his sheep on the side of Mount Sinai. Okay, that's not happening. He would have definitely been in the valley below, right? So how did he see it? It probably was elevated. Now, was it at the peak of it, like Charlton Heston climbed to? Probably not, because would a man leave his sheep for so long? That would probably be a several-day climb, right? It would be an intense climb. So, Charlton Heston got it wrong with that one, I'm going to say. I'm sorry. And so what happens? So he goes and says, hey, I want to see this bush. It's worth my effort of going to see. When the Lord saw that, he turned aside to him. God called out to him, Moses, Moses. And so we see this repetition of names, right? And once again, we've seen this before. If you're reading through Genesis, we've seen this. We've seen this of Abraham, Genesis chapter 22. We've seen this of Jacob, Genesis chapter 46. And so every time that God calls on somebody, we get double names. And he'll continue to do this almost all the way through Scripture, right? And so once again, if you're reading through Genesis, Moses, in your back of your mind, you're like, he did that to Abraham. He did that to Jacob, right? He did that to Israel. Okay. And so you're starting to see the scene of where Moses is going. Moses, and he said, here I am. And then he said, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place in which you are standing is holy ground. Notice, when he comes to the burning bush, what happens? God tells him two commands. One, the first, I am holy, right? I'm holy. Do not come near. I'm holy, right? Do not come near. The second one is what? To take your sandals off. It's not because the ground was hot. It's because that was just a common thing, which is still common today. You go into the Middle East today, you're going to take your shoes off, right? It's a weird thing, but you're going to do it, right? And so it was even common back then. So when he meets God, two things happen, two commands. I am holy, and revere me, honor me, keep me holy, right? Which is interesting. Thousands of years later, we're on this side of the cross, and when God meets people, somehow today we're afraid to tell them that God is holy and that they should keep him honored and they should keep him separate. And we're just like, oh, God's your best friend, and he can do whatever, right? There's some of that, but it is important to keep what's true, right? So he gets called out and meets this bush, and the first words that God says, I am holy and honor me. This is very kind of mindful of who we are and what we should keep. Do not come near to me, take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So, the first thing he tells them, I am holy and honor me. The second thing he tells them is what? Remember your past. Remember who I am. And what does he say? He says, remember who I am. I am the God of who? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's painting back to Genesis, right? So if you're reading your Hebrew, Or if you're just a Christian today in 2022, you're reading through the Bible, what's happening? You're getting that storyline. You're making sure that this is the same God of Genesis, right? That there is one God and he is the same. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. Notice there it says that he has seen his affliction. This is the same language that we just ended on Exodus chapter 2, right? That I've seen. It's the same action verbs. I've seen, I'm doing something. But notice what happens in verse 7. I've seen their affliction of my people. Dun, 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 dun. This is the first place. The guy says, these are my people. This is Israel, right? We don't know, right? We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen yet. We don't know who these Hebrews are. But God already knows. These are my people. I'm going to call them out. This is going to be Israel. It's just kind of an interesting point. That my people who are in Egypt, I've heard their cry, their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. And what happens? He says, I have come down. I have come down. We see this time and time again. We've already seen this throughout the book of Genesis, that this is just biblical language, that when God intervenes in humans' affairs, he uses the words, I have come down. And we'll see this in the future. What happens? John 1, 1 Corinthians, we see this in Philippians. What happens? Jesus came down, right? We see this. When God intervenes in with humans, he is coming down. Right, so I have come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up. Another biblical expression that not when he comes down, it's him intervening, but when they go up, when we go up, when anybody goes up, it means deliverance. It means promise. It's going to be used a whole lot of Exodus of talking about the promised land and he's taking them to. But it always means that God comes down to help, and when they go up, it means God is helping. He's doing what he came down to do. That they would go up to the land, to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. It sounds sticky. To the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Termites, all the other ites. Basically, these are all tribes, and you're going to learn more of these in a long time, if we ever make it to Joshua. But basically, these are all different tribes and groups of what is big picture called Canaanites, right? So you have the Canaanites, and you have a bunch of tribes. All these are tribes, and if you want to know where they were at, they were all over the place, but you can go into the book of Joshua and you know. The only thing that's really easy to remember is you see the Jebusites. That's Jerusalem. That's the area of Jerusalem. Pretty easy to remember that one. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression of which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Notice in verse 10, we see God's plan, right? He's come down for his people, and then what happens? We see the story. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh. Right? So God's coming down, God's intervening, but we see the plan of what's to come in Exodus. I'm going to send you to Pharaoh that you may bring up my people, the children of Israel. And so you kind of see where we're headed to, right? It's a great time to end. Let's pray. Father, we love you. We thank you so much. We thank you for your word.